In despair, King David's counselors asked, "If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" Do you identify with that question? Do you ever feel that the foundations of American society are crumbling? On January 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court decided that an unborn baby was a mere blob of tissue. In the meantime, 56 million unborn children have been put to death. Has our nation repented of this bloody outrage? Not quite. The Affordable Care Act celebrates abortion. Do you have serious moral objections to abortion? Big deal. You will include it in your health plan. According to the Centers for Disease Control, I found this information at cdc.gov, 1,144,500 Americans are living with HIV infection. In 2010, 15,529 AIDS patients died in the United States, bringing the total number of AIDS patients' deaths in the U.S. to 636,000. Has our nation repented of the homosexuality that introduced this deadly virus? Not exactly. This perversion is now to be celebrated as marriage. Drug and alcohol addictions have wreaked havoc in the United States, destroying marriages, impoverishing children, taking innocent life on the highway, crowding prisons. Has our nation repented of its lack of self-control? Not quite. Drug use is to be celebrated with the legalization of pot. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? How can God's people survive in a society reveling in and promoting its own demise? An encouraging and hopeful answer to that question is found in the story of Daniel. I ask you to open your Bible to chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver, which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Hosting a drinking party is foolish under any circumstances. But Belshazzar was partying under the very nose of calamity. The date was October 11th or 12th, 539 BC. Ugbaru, the Persian general, had already defeated the Babylonian army. On this night, Persian soldiers were encamped at the very gates of the city. An axe was suspended over Belshazzar's head. And his response? Let's get drunk. Belshazzar was not satisfied with being a complete fool. To his recklessness, he added the sin of contempt for God. Verse 4. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. This is a Jewish way of saying that the Babylonian gods were nothing. I'm reminded of those psalms that tell us that the idols of old had eyes but could not see, ears that could not hear, noses that did not smell, mouths that neither spoke nor drew breath, hands that could not feel, and feet that could not walk. But why was the king tempted to drink booze from the holy vessels plundered from the Lord's temple? Perhaps it was a display of bravado. We conquered Yahweh, Jehovah, the God of the Jews. Why should we be afraid of the Persian army? Belshazzar's confidence may be traced to two things. First, the city was impregnable. The ancient historian Herodotus says that the walls were 350 feet high in Babylon and 87 feet wide, enough for 4 chariots to drive side by side. Archaeologists believe that that was a gross exaggeration. The double wall of the city was probably 10 miles in its perimeter of the city and 40 feet high in places and very, very thick in certain spots. The thickness depended on the need for protection. But the city was massive and strong, and Babylon had not been invaded for 1,000 years. Second, the king's name, Belshazzar, means may Bel protect the king. Bel means Lord. It is the Aramaic form of the Hebrew Baal or Baal with which we are more familiar. I want you to put your thumb there in Daniel chapter 5 and turn to Isaiah chapter 46 for a moment. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 1 and 2. The prophet says in Isaiah 46:1, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops. Their idols are on beasts and cattle. These things you carry are loaded as burdens on weary beasts. They stoop, they bow down together, they cannot save the burden, but themselves go into captivity. Bel was a title given to Marduk, the chief Babylonian god. Do you remember the name Evil Merodach in the Old Testament? One of the names of a Babylonian king? Well, Merodach is Marduk. This god, the chief of the Babylonian gods, was called Bel Marduk, Lord Marduk, but it was shortened to Bel. Nebo, also mentioned here in Isaiah chapter 46, or Nabu, was regarded as Marduk's son. And you'll remember perhaps that the king who deported the Jews, Nebuchadnezzar, his name begins with the name of that god, Nebu. In religious festivals, images of these gods had to be carried. So imagine a worship processional, a celebration, and the gods are on carts being carried along, pulled by oxen, let's say. And in a time of crisis, these images had to be rescued. Oh no, we're being attacked. Let's grab our idols and run. They were a burden to those who worshiped them. And God is telling the people of Judah through Isaiah, idols have to be carried, but I, as the real God, carry you. If Belshazzar felt secure because of his name, may Bel protect the king. It was false security. Go back to Daniel 5 and verse 5 now. Daniel 5:5. Immediately the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. In the ruins of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, archaeologists have found a large throne room. It was 56 feet wide and 173 feet long. That's a big room, even by modern standards. 9,688 square feet, or about 10,000 square feet. If you were to enter that room at the main entrance, you'd be facing the long wall. And directly across from you in that long wall was a recess. The king may have been seated in this part of the room. Anyway, archaeologists have found that the wall behind the recess was covered with white plaster. When the king saw the disembodied hand writing on that plaster, he quailed. Verse 6. Then the king's color changed. That means he turned deathly white. And his thoughts alarmed him, and his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. Whenever I read that, I think about the Looney Tunes. Daffy Duck hiding behind a tree, Elmer Fudd hunting him with a gun, and Daffy's knees going knock, 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 knock. The king was terrified by the spooky fingers writing on the wall. But the cryptic message was even more disturbing. Verse 25. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. These words, apparently Aramaic, appeared on the wall as mere consonants. Perhaps you haven't thought about this before, but the consonants of words carry the meaning. The vowels only help with pronunciation as a general rule. And to illustrate this, I want you to actually give me a little bit of feedback here as I ask you a couple of questions. The letters W-M-N. What word is that? Woman. What's another word? W-M-N. What about the plural? Women, right? Okay, T-B-L. What's that? Table. Good. Here's a more modern one. C-M-P-T-R. Computer. Aramaic was written with the consonants, as was Hebrew. What Daniel did was to add vowels, making each word a past participle. Mene meant numbered. Verse 26. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. The word Mene was probably doubled to indicate the certainty of immediate judgment. Do you remember when Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had a dream one night? He saw 7 fat, sleek cows. And then 7 gaunt cows came and devoured them. And yet the scrawny cows grew no fatter. He woke up, went back to sleep, and dreamed again and saw 7 plump ears of grain. And then 7 withered, blighted ears of grain devoured them but grew no fatter. He wondered what in the world it meant. And finally Joseph came in and he interpreted the dreams, and he said that they represented 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of severe famine. Well, Joseph explains in the book of Genesis that the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God and God will shortly bring it to pass. Genesis 41 and verse 32. It is suspected that the doubling of numbered has the same effect. It is fixed by God, it is certain, and it's about to happen. Tekel means weighed. Verse 27. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Belshazzar didn't measure up. His disregard for the sovereignty of God rendered him worthless. Peres means divided. Verse 28. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. In the Medo-Persian alliance, Persia was dominant. Remember that we said only the consonants were written on the wall, and Daniel added the vowels in order to make the words. Well, the letters PRS can be pointed with different vowels. Another way to point the word is Paras, and that means Persia. So there's a play on words. The Persians would divide the Babylonian Empire. Verse 30 says, that very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. But how? The city was impregnable. Babylon hadn't been invaded in 1,000 years. The Euphrates River flowed through the city of Babylon, under the double walls. The Persians diverted the water from the river into a dry lake bed and then walked into the city on the riverbed and scaled the interior wall and attacked the city. Babylon fell. Belshazzar was dead. The government had collapsed. But do you know what? Daniel survived and thrived. Look at chapter 6 and verse 3. It reads, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps. The satraps were the leaders of the Persian provinces. This is now the Persian government. And Daniel distinguishes himself in it because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. How could this happen? Well, here's what I want you to remember. If you don't remember anything else, remember this. The righteous stand when their world crumbles. But what does it mean to be righteous? Righteousness is the courage to speak the truth. Go back to chapter 5 and verse 7. Chapter 5, verse 7, the king cried aloud after his face turned pale and his knees knocked together to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king said to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold about his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. If he was the king, why didn't he offer that the interpreter of the handwriting would be the second ruler in the kingdom next to him? Nebuchadnezzar is called Belshazzar's father in verse 2. This chapter is written in Aramaic. There aren't many Aramaic chapters in the Old Testament, but this is one of them. In Aramaic, as in Hebrew, there is no word for grandson or grandfather. A grandfather was called a father. A grandson was called a son. Belshazzar's biological father was Nabonidus, a man not named in the Old Testament. He was the ruling monarch. Belshazzar was second to him. And that is why Belshazzar is offering a position third in rulership. Those astrologers and enchanters and magicians did not give an interpretation. And the king became even more frantic. The queen heard about it. Probably this was not one of his wives who were already at the party. Perhaps his mother. And she came in and she said, King, there is a man in our empire a man in this city named Daniel. He has been known for many years as an interpreter of dreams and an explainer of riddles. You should call him, because the spirit of the holy gods is in him. You didn't get that quite right. The spirit of the holy God was in him. But Daniel was summoned, and he was offered the gifts and the power that Belshazzar had promised. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation." Daniel wanted the king to know that the truth was not for sale. It never should be. You all will remember a few months ago that Phil Robertson of Duck Dynasty had an interview with GQ magazine. And he stated his positions, his biblical thinking about homosexuality in no uncertain terms. And I personally don't approve of the actual word choices that he made. I could not quote him directly in this pulpit without giving deep offense. The Bible tells us to season our words with salt. And I believe in doing that. But I am very grateful for his position, and I'm also grateful for his courage, because A&E Network said, "Okay, you're not going to be on the show anymore." He said, "Fine, but I'm not changing my mind." And then all of his family said, "We're not going to be on the show either if you pull Dad off." And so A&E had to backtrack on that. The truth is not for sale if we are righteous. Verse 18, "O King, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty." In the following verses, 19 through 21, Daniel summarizes the fascinating account detailed in chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He saw this great tree with rich fruit for all. And a holy one, a watcher, came down from heaven and said, "Hew down the tree, cut off its branches, strip off the leaves, scatter the fruit." Only the stump was left in the ground, and it was bound with bronze and iron. And then the imagery changes, and so the object of the dream is spoken of as a person. "Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let him have the mind of an animal for 7 times. When Daniel interpreted that dream, he said, "King Nebuchadnezzar, this dream is about you. You are the great tree. You have grown rich and strong, and peoples depend upon you, but you are cruel to the oppressed. And you need to break off your sins and practice righteousness, because if you don't, then you will be turned into an animal. You'll crawl around like a cow and eat grass, and your hair will grow out like eagle's feathers, and your nails like claws." Maybe Nebuchadnezzar tried to humble himself, I don't know. But 12 months later, he'd forgotten all about the warning, it seems. He was on the roof of his palace in Babylon. And he looked around at all of his building projects. He was more a builder than a warrior. He loved to build things. And he said, "Look at this great Babylon, which I have made by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty." This palace was a citadel on the north side of the city. It had large courts, reception rooms, a throne room. It had residences, the famous hanging gardens, a vaulted terrace structure with an elaborate water supply for the trees and plants. Apparently the gardens were built by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median queen. There was an avenue, a processional avenue that ran beside the palace that he had paved with limestone and decorated with lion figures to honor the goddess Ishtar. Look at what I have done. I am so mighty. Immediately he dropped on his hands and knees and began to act like a cow. R.K. Harrison, in his introduction to the Old Testament, says he has personally observed a mental patient with boanthropy, the mental condition that afflicted Nebuchadnezzar, and he had all the same symptoms. Now, in chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, Daniel says, "You, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. This story was known to the grandson, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored." That's bold. For now, Christians are free to speak their minds in the privacy of their church buildings, but the truth is not welcome in the public square. People who take a biblical stand on moral issues are lambasted as bigots, racists, homophobes, sexists, misogynists. And it doesn't matter if you speak your positions in love. And of course, the most reviling judgment is that we are judgmental. Matt Walsh, on December 12th, 2013, had a great blog called "Jesus Wants You to Judge." And in that blog, he pointed out that the word judge, and he used dictionary sources to support this, just means to think, to form an opinion. People don't want us to judge. They don't want us to think specifically. They don't want us to think in the ways that God does. But brothers and sisters, this is no time to be intimidated into silence. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in 1906. In 1939, he was living in the United States. He was safe. But he made the decision to return to his native Germany in order to confront the evils of Adolf Hitler. And he said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak." The prophet Daniel did not stand because he kept his mouth shut. He stood because he had the courage to speak the truth. Reading the Bible, it's easy to overlook the bravery of the men who changed the world for God. For example, turn to Acts chapter 4 and verse 12. Acts chapter 4 and verse 12. Peter and John, uneducated Galilean men, stood before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, and this is what they said, Acts 4:12. "There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved." Now that is a safe thing to talk about in Sunday school, but this was not Sunday school. They were standing before the very men who had slapped Jesus, blindfolded him, mocked him, and demanded his crucifixion. They said, "There is no other name. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life." That's courage. And turn to Acts 17, verse 29. Acts chapter 17 and verse 29. Paul goes to Athens, which was at the time a center for culture like Paris is today. But it was also a center of idolatry. Idols, statues of gods and goddesses were everywhere, as well as many temples. Paul at the Areopagus, Acts 17:29, said this: "Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, a representation by the art and imagination of man." That took courage. He is looking into the eyes of the people that worship the works of art that are all over the city. And he says, these gods are not real. Righteousness is the courage to speak the truth. And righteousness is the consistency of a worthy example. Go back to Daniel chapter 6, this time verse 4. Daniel 6 and verse 4. Then the presidents and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful. And no error or fault was found in him. What would happen at work if auditors came in and examined every email you've ever written, every financial transaction you've ever done in the name of the company, examined the use of your time? Would there be no error or fault of any kind? Lack of integrity undermines even the best of stated positions. Denouncing the godless values of Hollywood is mere hypocrisy if we watch every popular TV show and movie. Bemoaning the assault on the sanctity of marriage is ludicrous if we break our own wedding vows, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health. What would you do if you owned a bakery and two women came in to order a wedding cake for their upcoming nuptials? Rachel Cryer and Laurel Bowman attempted to do just that. They placed an order at Sweet Cakes by Melissa in Portland, Oregon. They were refused based on spiritual principles. We can't do that. The Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industry found substantial evidence, as they put it, of discrimination based on sexual orientation. What would you do if you owned the bakery? Let's bring this closer to home. I think this is reasonable to expect in the not-so-distant future. What would you do as a preacher or as elders if a same-gender couple asked you to perform their wedding or offered to rent the auditorium for a wedding? I can tell you what the righteous do. The righteous do the right thing. That's what it means to be righteous. Go back to Daniel chapter 3 for a moment. There is a powerful story here about the three friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In the plain of Dura, Dura means fortification in Aramaic. This was probably located about 6 miles southeast of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar set up a golden image 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, probably with a very wide base so that it would stand. He gathered together all his officials. And he asked them to worship the image. Now, they were polytheistic people. And so it was no problem for them to worship this image. He wasn't asking them, give up your native gods and worship only my God. He was just wanting to unite his officials in one religion, or at least one religious activity, so that they would be loyal to him. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego couldn't do it. The heralds cried out, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, zither, harp, bagpipe, every kind of music, fall down and worship the image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Others noticed that this was not being observed by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so they were brought before the king, and the king said, "How dare you not honor my God? If you don't, I'm going to throw you into a burning fiery furnace. And what God can deliver you out of my hand?" He is saying, "I am mightier than any god." And they very courteously, and this is important, they were not rude or disrespectful. They very courteously declined to obey. Chapter 3:17. "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up." We are going to do the right thing. We believe that God has the power to save us. We believe that He may save us. We don't know. But come what may, we'd rather die than disobey our God. Chapter 6 and verse 10, we see the same attitude or conduct in the life of Daniel. Daniel's enemies in the Persian Empire encouraged Darius the Mede to make a decree that no one should pray to any god except to him for a month, at the penalty of being thrown to the den of lions. Daniel 6:10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem, and he got down upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Brothers and sisters, no matter what happens in our society, we need to continue to do as we have done previously if it's the right thing to do. Babylon was in imminent peril of collapse. And how did Belshazzar respond? He threw a big drinking party. The United States is in grave jeopardy too. And what is the national response? Let's celebrate our sins. David's counselors were in despair. In Psalm 11 and verse 3, they said, "If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" That's a great question, and thoughtful Christians are asking it these days. What will we do if faithful churches lose their tax-exempt status? What will we do if gospel preachers are jailed for speaking the truth? But David did not share his counselor's pessimism. Neither do I. I want you to listen to that verse again, Psalm 11:3, and then hear David's response in verse 4. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in His holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. Brothers and sisters, the righteous stand when their world crumbles. That's because God is on His throne. We have seen in Daniel's experience that righteousness is the courage to speak the truth and the consistency of a worthy example, but implied in that righteousness is the commitment to trust the Lord. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was King of Kings. He wasn't. Belshazzar thought he was invincible. He wasn't. Those distinctions belong to our God. And may His name be forever